Today we're delighted to welcome Tim O'Connor, who is the professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy at Indiana University. He's a member of its cognitive science program, and he's previously been a research fellow at the University of Notre Dame and also at St Andrews University in Scotland. His philosophical interests range very widely, although he's had a particular focus on the mind and free will, and especially since the publication in 2008 of his book, Theism and Ultimate Explanation, Tim has become increasingly involved in the science-religion discussion, and so we're very pleased to welcome him here, as well as helping out with the schools program that we've had here in Cambridge at the same time. But today his topic is the emergence of human persons between the Scylla of dualism and the Charybdis of reductionism. So thanks very much, Tim.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you all for coming and spending part of your afternoon to come out and hear me talk. I hope I won't disappoint. So, is there nothing new under the sun? Consider the great variety of complex structures and patterns of activity that have appeared over time within the 13.7 billion-year-old universe. No, wait, make that 13.8, as we've just learned recently. Physical, chemical, and much later biological and psychological structures and patterns. Is there reason to say that all such systems are, at bottom, nothing more than atoms in motion? This question has been with us unresolved ever since the 17th century, when the strongly anti-reductionist philosophy of nature, handed down from the ancient Greek Aristotle, was displaced by the successes of the new mechanical philosophy. Aristotle theorized that plants and animals are irreducible wholes whose behavior is governed in part by wholly separate organizing principles from those governing inanimate matter. By contrast, according to the new mechanical philosophy, all physical processes, whether in or out of living systems, are describable and predictable in principle in terms of laws of motion governing their basic parts. Obstacles to simple versions of the mechanical philosophy soon became apparent, but the basic reductionist vision of the natural world as fully describable and explainable in principle solely by reference to the properties and forces that govern the world's most elementary constituents was embraced and continues to be embraced by many thinkers, such as, for example, physics Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg, and perhaps the world's leading philosopher, David Lewis, until his death in 2001. Opposition to this vision was generally rooted in its perceived inability to explain the human mind. The proposed alternatives to austere reductionism were often equally extreme. On the mind-body dualism of René Descartes, 17th century philosopher mathematician, and his followers, minds are wholly distinct substances from bodies, possessed of their own causal powers, which include the power to affect and be affected by bodies, more specifically the brains that inhabit the bodies that belong to individual minds in a happy but theoretically strange monogamy. Others, unsatisfied with the bifurcation of the world into two radically distinct kinds of substances, which have seemingly inexplicable tendencies to interact in such monogamous pairings, ran the reduction in the opposite direction. It is the category of body that is reducible in the end to that of mind, more exactly to collections of ideas or particular perceptual states, such as your present visual and auditory states as you hear me speak. Such was the famous proposal of the 18th century Irish idealist philosopher George Berkeley, and then in more radical guise still, the Scot David Hume. As the special sciences of chemistry and later biology and psychology began to develop and mature, it became clear that the structures and processes that are the focus of these domains could be rigorously studied in terms having nothing to do with those of basic physics. Purely biological concepts and dynamical principles could powerfully describe biological processes completely independently of any appeal to physics. Beginning with John Stuart Mill, the sensible middle ground position came to be adopted by those came to be occupied by those adopting the general philosophy of what I will call emergence, according to which new properties and laws, in some sense, arise out of certain types of physical arrangements, something that could not have been predicted in advance on the basis of the more fundamental physical principles, but instead must be accepted as basic, as simply irreducible. Important philosophical emergentists in this mostly British tradition up through the first third of the 20th century were Samuel Alexander, C. Lloyd Morgan, and the chemist-turned-philosopher C.D. Broad. Two factors were central to the demise of this robust scientific philosophical tradition. First, there was no shared precise concept of emergence. Instead, different thinkers gave their own glosses to it in ways that weren't obviously mutually consistent. As a result, it seemed to be a rather vague philosophical viewpoint or stance than a concept that could be made rigorous and potentially tested in relation to quantified theories. It didn't help that the notion of emergence these thinkers were attempting to articulate was a species of a more general stance of holism that was also developed in an anti-scientific direction in the philosophy of Hegel and the absolute idealists of the late 19th century. So it took on a sort of disreputable air by its association with this other sort of philosophy. Second, and even more importantly, a couple of spectacular scientific successes of the 20th century seem to provide direct evidence against emergence as these thinkers conceived it. Common to all the emergentist views of this era was a neatly layered understanding of nature. There are discrete and isolated strata or levels within the most complex systems found in the natural world, right? So fundamental physical, chemical, molecular, biological, and so on. That was this kind of layer cake conception of the physical world. Each level features a unified system with its own same level properties and special laws governing their coevolution over time. The first major blow to this picture came in the 1920s with the advent of quantum mechanics, which was able to explain the basic properties of hydrogen, the simplest chemical atom, in terms of the arrangement and properties of its subatomic constituents. And of course, in the 1950s, Watson and Crick uncovered the double helix structure of DNA, a key part of a successful program of analyzing the phenomena of biological life in more fundamental electrochemical terms. In each case, properties of a special science were seen to encompass complex phenomena involving lower-level entities, thereby puncturing the hermetically sealed layers of nature that were postulated by the British emergentists. Does this kind of evidence from 20th century science, and the two mentioned are, of course, just simply prominent instances of a whole raft of scientific data pointing in the same general direction, does such evidence decisively or strongly confirm the reductionist view? Many suppose so. But this judgment rests on a conflation of the general concept of emergence with the particular account of emergence proposed by the earlier British emergentists, an account that appears unnecessarily crude in hindsight. They thought in terms of relatively insulated layers in nature, whereas we now know that lower-level processes often directly impinge upon and partly regulate those at higher levels. One need think only of the subtle chemical influences on mood and cognition that the work of recent decades has revealed. But emergence need not be yoked to the simple picture of earlier theorists. It is quite possible that higher-level features of a system have a downward causal influence on the evolving microstructure that in turn sustains them, even as the lower-level processes play a vital dynamical role in the way emergent processes themselves unfold. In other words, we should replace the picture of mostly horizontal or same-level causal patterns within each level with one in which there is a complex web of myriad upward and downward causal influences that jointly determine the system's evolution through time. Nothing in the successes of the more fundamental sciences in illuminating some higher-level phenomena preclude the applicability of this more subtle sort of emergentist framework. there is a tendency, especially for scientists, well, unlike George Ellis here, who's rather philosophical, but there is a tendency for many scientists to conflate what we have methodological reason to take as the most fruitful starting hypothesis with what we have evidential reason to believe is true. Even if the mental is emergent from the physical, if you wish to understand the details of just how mental features emerge and the differences they make to the overall functioning of an organism, you must have a thorough understanding of the purely physical processes from which they emerge. Thus, in practice, you should push a reductionist approach as far as you can, thereby isolating any emergent features there may be, allowing for highly specific descriptions of their character and function. But your typical scientist, unlike the philosopher, does not spend much time thinking about what will turn out to be true at the end of scientific inquiry. Rather, she is thinking about what working hypotheses are most useful in advancing current understanding of a specific domain. Right? And I take the emergentist picture to be, in the end, a philosophical vision about what is ultimately the case about the world. It's not just a useful way of thinking about how contemporary sciences at different levels of nature relate. At any rate, that's my bias as a philosopher. Right? I want to know what fundamentally is the case, or at least I want to think about possible models about what is actually the case. Right? And we know our current theories are not complete, but still we can contemplate these different pictures, reductionism on the one hand or some variety of emergence on the other. Furthermore, it seems to many of us that emergence is no mere theoretical possibility. The nature of human and animal consciousness, and perhaps mentality more generally, appear to be spectacular counterinstances to the program of reductive analysis. Despite the enormous strides in neuroscience since its infancy in the 1950s, no one has a clue when it comes to understanding these mental phenomena, as opposed to many of their neural underpinnings, in reductive physical terms. It remains a mystery how and why our highly structured neural architecture gives rise to, for example, subjective experiences, thoughts, and feelings. The situation seems unlike that facing biologists in the early 20th century. They, lacking a good understanding of the biochemical mechanisms that sustain life, some scientists of that time were willing to countenance the idea that some or all biological properties are not reducible to anything more fundamental. At the present time, by contrast, there is a great deal of information concerning basic neural mechanisms underlying the complex operations of the human brain. And the obstacle to reduction of psychological phenomena is not our relatively impoverished current understanding of how low-level mechanisms together give rise to much more complex physical functions directly tied to subjective experience. Rather, the obstacle is that the development of increasingly sophisticated models of more complex functions doesn't seem to take us any closer to the goal. Conscious experience continues to appear to be an altogether different kind of phenomena, intrinsically, from those of electrochemistry. I join some other philosophers in suggesting that it's time to abandon the reductionist dream in favor of an emergentist understanding on which the appearance of new basic properties within certain neurally complex physical systems must be accepted, as the British emergentist Samuel Alexander put it, with the natural piety of the investigator. That's just how we find the world to be, right? Rather than imposing a preconceived, a priori, reductionist vision on the world. It is a fundamental fact which may nevertheless be fruitfully studied and eventually explained in non-reductive fashion by spelling out the basic inventory of emergent properties, detailing the precise conditions under which physical systems give rise to them, and isolating the precise behavioral impact their presence has on the system. This seems to me to be a very important point that's not always appreciated. Explanation of some phenomena need not always be reductive. Right? Some people think, well, if you can't reduce it, then you can't explain it. All right? But you can explain a phenomena by revealing it as consisting in a complex not just a complex web of lower-level phenomena, right, but as something that is embedded in and causally sustained by such phenomena. There's still explanation to be had there. It's just of a non-reductive sort. There are a variety of ways that people have sought to characterize emergence. Philosophically, the most significant understandings are those that challenge the claim that the microphysical realm is causally closed or complete, with no high-level properties directly affecting microphysical phenomena, right? So you have this vision that, well, at the level of microphysics, everything that happens can be explained in terms of some ultimately completed microphysical theory. So including the microphysical processes going on in my brain right now, those can be, in principle, they can be fully described and explained in purely microphysical terms. The notion of emergence that I want to put forward wants to challenge that claim, right? And to suggest that high-level properties of the mind, on which I'm focused now, can ultimately will have a causal impact on those very microphysical processes in some sort of fashion. So on this, what I'll call strong form of emergence, and so on your handout, if you've been sort of keeping an eye on that, we'll be at the second page already. On this strong form of emergentism, emergent properties are basic properties, no less so than the negative charge or mass on current physics. They're basic in the sense that they're not realized by more complex structural properties. They're in that sense of basic. As such, they make a non-redundant causal difference to how the world unfolds. Only this strong conception of emergence can underwrite certain metaphysical claims about the fundamental reality of at least some composite systems and the fundamental explanatory significance of the laws that appear to regulate them, including especially the complex systems that are human persons. Sometimes theorists appear to have a weaker notion of emergence. So here's something you need to know. If you read any of the philosophical and scientific literature on this sort of part-whole question, the term emergence is all over the place. It's a very evocative word, and many people are drawn to it, but people tend to mean different things by it. And sometimes I think some theorists have a much weaker notion in mind than what I have. On this weaker notion, whenever complex systems exhibit a pattern of activity that is a distinct kind from the sort of activity exhibited by basic physical systems, then you have emergence. Well, it's uncontroversial that we have emergence in that sense, right? We have kinds of macroscopic phenomena who, if you want to describe them in macroscopic terms, you can't use the terms of basic physics, right? Different concepts are required, different forms of laws or principles are required, biology, and so on, psychology. We know that. So in that sense, in that weak sense of emergence, we know that that is true. But what the strong emergentist is interested in is the question of whether, all of that high-level patterns and applicable concepts is ultimately fixed by, and in some sense reduces to, a more fundamental level of description, including dynamical principles, that given by fundamental physics. Okay, so here's to give you an example of why we might care to think hard about the notion of strong rather than weak emergence. A basic metaphysical question that philosophers ask concerns the relationship in general of parts and wholes. So philosophers will ask, do wholes really, very often in philosophy discussions, really, some emphasis, do wholes really, that is fundamentally, exist at all? Or is our reference to them a mere convenience, owing to the finite perceptual and computational abilities that we have? A useful fiction for referring to what is, in fact, but a swarm of particles, obeying completely general laws of physics that have led them to collate in a stable bonding relationship for a time, such that they come to constrain themselves, you might say, for that time. That's the question. So, look at this lectern in front of me. Is there really a composite object in addition to all the subatomic particles arranged lectern-wise? Right? Why should we say that? Why should we say that if everything concerning the trajectory those particles trace through space and time can, in principle, be fully accounted for without mentioning any composite object that is, allegedly, the lectern? Of course, looking at the world in a less fine-grained way, in the ways of chemistry, biology, psychology, solid, middle-sized goods, is useful, indeed necessary, to beings like us, and discloses patterns of interest to us that one wouldn't see if one peered, assuming one were able to, directly at the behavior of fundamental particles in fields, not seeing the forest for the trees and all that, right? It's just that, strictly speaking, it appears to be dispensable. Another way to get at what's behind the question is this. When God, a being not subject to our rather severe limits of perspective and computation, counts up all the physical objects in the universe, does he have to count the lectern in addition to all the particles that at any time have constituted the lectern? If you say yes, why should he not also count the lectern plus your right ear? Now, that sounds absurd, of course, but wherein lies the difference exactly? Some simple answers may occur to you, but careful reflection shows that it is very hard to draw a relevant distinction between the lectern and such arbitrary scattered objects such as the lectern in your right ear, unless there is reason to suppose that the lectern, unlike the other candidate object, the lectern plus ear, does fundamental causal work. That is, unless the lectern earns its keep in the world. I don't see that this condition is satisfied by systems that merely are weakly emergent. That may well be that a system be weakly emergent, exhibit new interesting characteristic patterns of activity, may well be a necessary condition on a complex system's earning its keep, but it does not suffice. The need for a stronger variety of emergence is even clearer when we move from the general case of parts and wholes to the particular case of human beings and the ever-changing parts that compose us. A basic pre-theoretical stance that we all share is to see human beings as having a special dignity in nature, as autonomous or self-directed agents, as being properly subject to moral appraisal, and as having moral worth, such that imposing harm or death on human beings is in most circumstances a grave moral wrong. Again, it is very hard to see, from a clear-eyed metaphysical point of view, why these things should be true if human persons do not, in the final analysis, make any fundamental difference to the way the world unfolds. The ability to freely affect the world that we suppose ourselves to have, to make choices and affect how the world, or at least our tiny little portion of the world, unfolds, does depend, of course, on stable forms of physical organization in our environment, so that we are able to harness physical forces in specific directions. But it also requires the future to be open to real alternative courses of action, that not just be an illusion, that sense we have that there are these possibilities out before us that we can choose from among. We need the right kind of causal indeterminacy and the ability to exploit the opportunities it presents in a goal-directed way, a capacity to form choices so that it's not mere chance-like indeterminacy, but it's indeterminacy that is resolved through purposive choice. A third way in which emergent properties are relevant to the concerns of philosophy is one we noted at the outset. Emergence provides a satisfying way to underwrite the fundamental unity of our universe, avoiding the extremes of reductionism and mind-body dualism. Both extremes have long seemed philosophically unsatisfactory. Reductionism is unsatisfactory because it appears to be inconsistent with the distinctive character of our mental lives. The qualities of mental experience seem quite unlike physical qualities as disclosed by science. And there is an irreducible subjectivity or point of view associated with being a subject of experience, and with the special significance we attach to human and other conscious animals. Mind-body dualism, on the other hand, is unsatisfactory because it seems incongruent with facts about the deeply embodied nature of animal mentality, as reflected, for example, in the way that psychological maturation is tied to the process of gradual biological development. On strong, no less than weak emergentism, there is no distinct entity, which is the purely human or animal mind, purely mental substance. Instead, we are complex biological systems that undergo processes that are partly distinct from, though always causally sustained by, the biological, and specifically neurobiological, processes of the living organism. Finally, I note that an emergentist vision of human beings has relevance to the philosophical religious question of the possibility of survival of death. If reductionism were true, survival of death is hard to envision. When I die, my body will decay and my constituting particles will scatter throughout the biosphere, possibly entering other human beings, right? And you might say, well, that's not a problem. God's just got to, if the way we survive death is that God ultimately resurrects us from the dead, he can keep track of all the particles, right, where they've all gone, and just regather them at the time, at a time of his choosing, and voila, there you are. That's not sufficient, right? Think about this. Perhaps all the particles that compose my body at some point on my 10th birthday are no longer part of me now, okay? And so they're out there somewhere, right? They haven't disappeared. And suppose God were to extract all of those, and maybe having to take little bits of you in the process, who knows? They may not currently help to compose your body, and to recreate me in identical arrangement, right? Including with the sort of embedded psychological dispositions and so forth in my brain, and so to put together this 10-year-old Tim, an identical copy, and actually constituted by the very particles that 10-year-old Tim was constituted by, and put that down right next to me now. Well, that would be quite a spectacle, and quite shocking to me. But he sure would not be me, right? So it seems clear that if we are biological beings, material causal continuity is part of our identity. Our parts, no individual fundamental part of me is essential to my identity. It's part of the very nature of being a biological thing that one undergoes constant change of parts, right? So I say it would be no good if that continuity, process of continuity has been completely destroyed, stopped, and the particles in the body decays and the particles go their separate ways, then simply regathering the parts is not sufficient for reconstituting me, the very individual. It might suffice for the purposes of fooling my wife, right? She might say, oh, there's Tim, he's back again, and everything, but it wouldn't be me. It would be a duplicate of me. Emergence, like a mind-body dualism, opens up some possibilities concerning survival of death, though it takes quite a bit of imagination to see how emergence might help. Alas, I don't have time to develop that suggestion here. So I just want to suggest that it has some relevance. At the same time, adopting an emergentist perspective as opposed to a stronger sort of mind-body dualism further enables a conciliatory attitude between science and religion. On the one hand, it avoids positing a this far and no further attitude to the attempt to attain a thorough scientific understanding of the fundamental processes that make up the ongoing lives of the remarkable animals that are human beings. On the other hand, it also serves to remind one of the very partial and ongoing nature of scientific inquiry, encouraging the humility and open-mindedness characterizing the scientific spirit at its noblest. There remain wide open, religion-friendly possibilities concerning the nature of the human mind, and any conclusive scientific pronouncements on them are likely a long ways off. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jim. Well, we've got a good amount of time here for questions and discussion, which is probably a good thing, so I'm sure that will have stimulated plenty of thoughts and contributions. So over to you, please, yes. Okay.
Oh, thank you. I have a few questions, and they are about your argument. So maybe for the sake of time, I just ask one, which is tied to the way you motivate emergentism.
Yes.
Please ask me to repeat if my accent is too strong. You say that. Okay, je parle français. You motivate the the approach with downward causation, but it seems to me that downward causation is consistent with reductionism. Do you have any consideration?
Well, not in the sense in which I'm using the term downward causation. And so I agree with you. But the problem of a lot of the discussion surrounding these terms is that people are systematically using the same words to mean somewhat different things. And it can be rather challenging, actually, to even sort out those differences. I don't know what sort of academic sort of training you might have had, but I do know that scientists and philosophers often have a hard time even understanding exactly how we're thinking about things when we use sometimes the very same vocabulary. So let me say that I think weak emergence, right? Weak emergence is the idea that, look, what is clearly the case is we have certain kinds of stable, complex systems that constrain, in some sense, the behavior of particles, right? To use a very trivial kind of example that the famous neuroscientist Roger Sperry used, consider a particle that's embedded in a wheel rolling down a hill, right? That particle follows that trajectory through space and time, right? He'll say, is to be explained by the fact that it's embedded in this larger system, right? It's not just little micro-physical interactions with its neighbor that explain the fact that it's following this sort of trajectory. It's the fact that it's part of this complex system. He would say that's emergence, okay? That involves downward causation. The overall configuration and the stability of it is exerting, but not by directly causing not by interfering with the microphysical interaction of the particle with its neighboring particles, right? But by putting this constraint, this macroscopic constraint on it that forces it to follow certain patterns. I would not, in the sense in which I'm wanting to speak of downward causation, that is not, or not necessarily, I take that not to be sufficient reason to think that is downward causation in my sense. When I speak of downward causation, I want to say, no, if wheels actually exerted downward causation, something I'm not inclined to believe, but science could surprise us, right? But if that's in fact going on, then in my terms, what would be going on is that something about an overall property of that wheel, perhaps its shape, something, right, is directly influencing some of the behavior of its component particles, causing them to interact differently with the local, the very small scale environment in which they find themselves than they otherwise would if they were not embedded within that structure. And that's what I'm wanting to claim. I mean, it's just a concept, right? And then it's an empirical question whether there is strong emergence in the world. But if there is strong emergence, the idea would be that no, the microphysical processes are no longer complete to capture what's going on. We've got some further fundamental force-like entities playing a role here in addition to mass, spin, charge, right, magnetic moment, and so on, whatever these fundamental physical forces turn out to be. You're going to have irreducible causal influence coming from mental properties themselves. And the reason for that is mental properties themselves are basic properties on this picture. And so any basic properties comes with a suite of dispositions, right? Just like negative charge is a property that has certain dispositional tendencies to repel like charged properties with a certain degree of force relative to other factors. That's part of its nature, it's part of its dispositional structure. So the idea would be mental qualities have a basic kind of causal dispositional profile, and they directly impinge into the system that has them. All right, sorry, that was a very long-winded answer. Please follow up.
Is it okay?
Yes.
I think I see, I understand the picture, but it seems precisely to me that it's consistent with reductionism to say that the whole, provided that you have an explanation for the whole, has a causal relationship with other things at the lower level, because the whole is explainable in terms of lower level, so it's homogeneous causation, if you want. There's no cross-level causation. Just,
Yeah,
just
of course.
what you said about the mental properties. I'm not going to ask too much about this, but it seems that this is precisely one of the claims that is arguable in your.
Sure.
So
Everything I said is arguable.
Yeah,
It's philosophy.
Right.
Everything's up for grabs.
And then it's a bit unfair to use it as an evidence.
Okay, good.
For the claim.
Yeah, well, that's a big question, but I do take seriously our conception of our own awareness of our mental states. You could say that's an illusion, right? It seems to us we have direct acquaintance with the intrinsic qualities of conscious experiences that we have, right? When I have a pain, right, the intrinsic character of pain seems disclosed to me, right? Now, I think that's a pervasive. Everyone thinks that. That's why people think, you get all these articles in Scientific American, trying to solve the mystery of consciousness. Why? It's because we seem to have direct acquaintance with qualities of the mind that it seems like their intrinsic character, right, can only be grasped by having those qualities, right? And there doesn't seem to be any way to mesh that with the way the physical sciences describe the basic properties of the physical world. Okay. Now, one possible move is to say, all you've got going on really there are beliefs. You might say there might be something about the way you might say the human being is a machine, the computational machine of a very sophisticated kind, and it has belief states which are complex. You might think purely physical, complex states of a certain kind, and for whatever reason, right, currently unknown to us, we are caused to have belief states of the form, I'm having an experience of such and such indescribable intrinsic quality. And all these beliefs are false, right? There is no such state, experiential state, strictly speaking, that's disclosed in conscious awareness, right? But we have beliefs that we do. It's an illusion. We're subject to pervasive illusion throughout our conscious lives. You can say that, right? But A, I think that's a highly skeptical hypothesis, right? And B, you may have deep epistemological problems about accounting for the justification of our acceptance of scientific theories, since all science is fundamentally built ultimately on experience, the base of experience. And if you're positing illusion at the very base of experience, right? Because when a scientist says, "I'm aware of," this measuring device, being here, right? And I'm aware of my own purposes in reporting my results in the way that I do, so that others hear them and integrate them with other results, and we can build up theories and so forth. You've got to be able to tell a story then about why we're justified in believing the theories we do about the world. I mean, the worry, to put it kind of in a simple metaphorical way, the worry is you're going to end up sawing off the branch on which you sit as a scientist if you suddenly say that experience itself is fundamentally illusory. Okay? Perhaps I should stop there.
Yes, go ahead, please. If you can wait for the microphone, just we can just coming along. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can hear this.
Yes.
I want to go back to the original question.
Okay.
Deprived of all this business about human feelings and so on, the lecture presumably doesn't have these.
That's right.
You used it as an example.
Right.
I wanted an explanation of what you have here on line 4 of the second page.
Yep.
So when you're criticizing weak emergence, and in brackets you say, not addition of basic laws of propensities, but rather specific forms of absence, and then you have increasing systemic constraints, etc., etc. Now that seems to me to introduce enough downward causation, and I think this is the original question you were asked, actually. But you've explained it in terms of, you've put a lot of emphasis on the word absence there.
Yeah, I should have said, I skipped over when I was, in fact, I was trying to be conscious to move along. But this is the way some proponents of weak emergence themselves want to, there's a scientist, Terry Deacon, right? This is his preferred way of thinking about emergence. So this wasn't intended to be a criticism. It was a characterization coming from a theorist who endorses this way of thinking about emergence. Okay?
But it's not enough for you.
Yeah, but it's not enough.
Now, why is it not enough?
It's not enough just for my purposes, you might say. This might be a correct depiction, the right way to think about certain kinds of complex systems, right? We have dynamical systems theories, specifically in biology and more abstractly, right? There are theorists who want to talk about dynamical systems. This might be a sufficient way, or in the neighborhood of a way, that captures what is distinctive about those kinds of systems that they are trying to theorize about, to understand the relationship of part and whole for those systems. All I'm saying, that's great. I don't think emergence is everywhere. I've been focusing, as you'll notice, on the human mind. That's the only case where I feel that we clearly have good evidence for strong emergence, a stronger variety of emergence than weak emergence. I think it's an open question whether it's more ubiquitous than that, right? That it could turn out that despite the fact that we've learned that biological systems are enormously complex at the electrochemical level, still there are subtle, strong emergent features of certain kinds of organisms that play a fundamental guiding role. That's an empirical question, right? And I don't think that's conclusively resolved. I'm not sure, but I take certain kinds of systems biologists like Dennis Noble to possibly be suggesting that. I say here again, we get the philosopher versus the scientist. I have a hard time knowing whether he has in mind, he clearly has some kind of emergentist, non-reductionist picture. He's very explicit about that. Whether it's merely weak emergence or strong emergence, I'm not certain. So my point was, I'm most interested in strong emergence, because strong emergence, I think, is required to subserve the kinds of claims we want to make about human beings, that we are in control of the choices we make in such a way that we are morally evaluable, and that we have fundamental moral worth. I think only on...
That's satisfactory, because
Okay.
I was wanting to get that clear that that's what you're after.
Yeah.
We're just going to have Rodney in a second. Can I have a little follow-up question, though, just on that? So, what do we like? So, if humans are the paradigmatic kind of top-down causation kind of model, if you like, the one that you prove, a strong emergence. So, chimpanzees, do we go to slightly less strong? I mean, do we have an evolutionary scale here, or do we have a demarcation? How do you? Good. Okay, so let's go to primates.
Good. Right, I take it that primates, other animals that we have good reason to think have subjective conscious experiences as we do, exhibit strong emergence, right? Of course, the question is how far down you go the animal scale, at which point you no longer have purely mechanical systems corresponding to which there is nothing like a subjective point of view. That's a kind of mysterious question. It'd be a very, very difficult scientific question to try to figure out, right? The reason we're confident in the case of other primates and most mammals is because their neurophysiology is sufficiently similar to ours, and we know that certain kinds of neurophysiological structures subserve our ability to have conscious awareness. And so we assume there's not a sufficient degree of difference to such that they would not have that as well. But what you do have, but then you might say, so does this mean there's a kind of sharp cutoff point, a discontinuous cutoff point? I would want to say the type and quality and complexity of emergent level psychological phenomena. I assume there is a smooth gradation of that sort. So you get less complex psychological structure, conscious psychological structures of experiences, thoughts, and so forth as you go further down. But all this, on my way of thinking, I get to say, well, that's for the scientists to tell us about, right? I'm giving you an abstract kind of way of thinking about things, how it works in the details. What would be the basic inventory of emergent kinds of qualities? How do they, right? You're going to have to impose some kind of order on them if they're to admit of scientific description. So, little bits of color-like experience that show up in our experience. What are the fundamental elements? What is the mental paint, if you like? The fundamental mental paint and corresponding to our different sense modalities and our thoughts. There's going to have to be some kind of ordering relationship going on among them if there's to be a systematic scientific account of emergence. I assume there is such a thing. I have no idea how to do that. I'm not a scientist, and I don't think anybody, even a well-informed scientist, is not in a position to do that either. But that's ultimately what we would expect to be possible.
Rodney.
Yes. Thank you. The very concept of lectern is embedded in a web of meaning to do with giving lectures, to do with matters of the intellect. What it's made of, and whether its atoms and molecules are sufficient to explain its structure, beta atoms and molecules are sufficient to explain its structure, is irrelevant, really. Could be metal, could be wood, you name it. You name it. But the very fact that we call it a lectern gives it some non-reductive emergent meaning, it seems to me.
Yeah, this raises a big issue about the social construction of reality, you might say, certain parts of reality. Sorry, that's to use a kind of philosophical jargon to describe what you're talking about. Right, we impose concepts on even inanimate bits of the world that aren't even particularly interesting as complex structures from a physical point of view. But then this has, you might say, an impact on our behavior, right? This was brought here because it's a lectern, you might say, not because it was a piece of physical structure that had this particular configuration. Right, money would be another great example, right? Just a dollar bill of some kind, a pound note, it's just a sheet of paper with some ink on it and so forth. Physically, that's all it is, but it has great significance. And people sometimes kill each other in order to obtain these little bits of physical paper and so forth, right? And work very hard in order to gain these things. And that only makes sense. You have to understand this whole economic system that is created in part by agreement among human beings to treat these physical things as having this significance. Right? That's what I mean by socially constructed. Money doesn't intrinsically have value, economic value. We impose it through a very complex processes. Right, I grant all that, and I want. That's obviously true. Okay, but the thought is, unless you believe that there is strong right, we don't think that a pound note is exerting any kind of fundamental, irreducible, downward causal, efficient causal influence on the behavior of its constituents or those of its surroundings, right? Right. What we do believe is that when human beings visually or tactilely perceive one of these objects, cognizes it in a certain way, conceives it as a thing of value, therefore safely tucks it away when walking about London, downtown, and so forth, it influences their behavior, right? But it's mediated through mental processes. Absent those mental processes, right, there would be, these categories would be, purely arbitrary, right? Presumably, and notice they're very interest dependent. It's human beings impose these categories because we have a certain interest, we have certain perceptual faculties that, for whom things like lecterns or pound notes can be physically salient. We could imagine other radically different kind of cognizers for whom carving up the world just in terms of middle-sized objects, there was a much different natural way of doing that, and they could get along just fine. And for them, the category of lectern wouldn't have the significance that it does, right? So maybe here's a test, for whether all by itself lecterns or pound notes are in some interesting, in some deep sense, playing a fundamental causal role in the world. If you were to extract the finite minds from the world, what would you say about them then? Then I think you'd say, they're no different in principle from some rock you find on the beach, right?
So I think what you're doing is broadening, going back to Aristotle, you're broadening causality beyond efficient causes and so on.
Good, right. But I guess maybe I'm betraying a bias, that the efficient causal category is capturing the fundamental way of understanding the world, and perhaps, and even when we need the role of any other categories we need that would be associated with strongly emergent properties. So a category of purpose, That's not a fundamental physical efficient causal notion, but it is a concept that you need to describe minds, and if minds are irreducible, that means that in some sense the role of purpose is strongly emergent too. But this is a very, you might say, let me just make this final comment. If there is you're pointing to what many philosophers would say is a deeply flawed way of thinking about things, that is overly atomistic rather than a relational picture of reality. And you might say there's just seeing things as embedded in social networks gives things a kind of reality. I'm just suspicious of all that because it's mind dependent, it seems to me, at the end of the day. That is human mind dependent. Reality for me is mind independent, at least human mind independent. Okay, and so it's useful. We can't do without these categories. I'm not, of course. So we will. I use them. We will all use them. We have to use them. But that doesn't mean that they play a fundamental role in a kind of privileged, mind-independent way of categorizing reality. And I assume there is such a way. I assume there is a God's eye point of view on reality. And I think from a God's eye point of view on reality, those kind of concepts just are not applicable or are not deeply explanatory.
Please in the middle here, and then we'll go to George. Yes.
Hello, Tim.
Sorry, Tim. Well, George is ahead of you. Yep, that's okay.
Hi,
Right,
Tim.
so,
I'm just wondering what you think about the idea that, or whether strong emergence has any meaning or utility when it arrives at irreducibly complex phenomena such as quantum mechanics and this idea that more and more we're reading and understanding there's a kind of fundamental link between what's going on in the quantum world and consciousness. I'm wondering whether does it perhaps arrive at a point where it becomes impossible to talk about or cognise, to use your word. Is it too abstract? Does it have any room? Does your strong emergentism have any room when it arrives at the quantum world, so to speak?
Yeah. I of course am no expert on any of this, but I do talk to my philosopher of physics friends as well as occasionally physicists. And it seems clear that there is some kind of holism in quantum mechanics itself, right? A little bit of debate about how exactly to characterize that and so forth, right? So I think in my terms, I think we do see a kind of, at a very low grade of physical reality, a kind of strong emergence. So I would say just understanding quantum entangled systems in and of themselves. Now, the relationship of quantum mechanical phenomena to possibly directly influencing macroscopic level processes, this is subject to a lot of debate, right? And so I'm not going to weigh in on that. I don't know if you have in mind interpretations of quantum mechanics on which somehow conscious experiencers, like Wigner, thought are directly exerting causal influences on discontinuous influence on the unfolding of quantum mechanical systems. That's a very controversial interpretation of quantum mechanics, and I think not nearly as popular as maybe it once was. So, but at any rate, that's totally outside of my ability to make any pronouncement on.
Yeah.
George.
I agree with
Can you wait for the microphone? Sorry, microphone's just coming. Yeah, thanks.
I agree with almost everything you say until you say you don't believe in mind, in effect, and I can't agree with that at all.
I don't believe in mind?
Mind, yeah. You say if it's to do with mind, it's not real.
Oh.
But so let me give you the example of computers. I think computers are wonderful examples of a dualist system, because the computer hardware does nothing without the software, and the software is not a physical thing, it's an abstract thing. And that abstract thing is what makes the computer run. Now, I'm not going to buy into a direct analogy of the mind and the brain, but I think there are aspects of the mind which are modeled between mind and computers, but there are aspects of the mind and brain relation which are modeled by computers. And I think computers clearly are dualist systems because the software is not a physical thing, and it does make the thing work. And so I think it's a useful thing to pursue.
Yeah. Good question. I'll just make a brief comment. George has thought and written about this sort of thing longer and harder than I have. But my gut instinct in thinking about that sort of example is to say, look, if take a given computer in which a program has been embedded, right? There is a purely physical description of that computer as a thing at a given time, and it unfolds according to electrophysical properties, right? With power source and all that, and that will let us assume, reduces it to even more fundamental physical level, right? If you want to understand the evolution of that physical object, the states it's in, moment to moment, right? In principle, if reductionism is true, unless we've got some sort of strong notion of emergence going on here, which I don't think we automatically have reason to think there is, then it can be understood in purely physical terms. And we can't do that because of our computational limits. So for us, it's not only necessary, but also even more useful to describe it in terms of the running of a program, which, as you say, can be embedded in many machines. It can be physically realized in many different types of configurations. In principle, very different configurations even from the kinds of computers that we have. Right. I grant all that, but it's thinking of that as running a program is again, something that we do, right? We're imposing on it. I mean, we've set up we've harnessed physical structures in such a way that they will conform to these abstract patterns, and we interpret the outputs of computers, things that show up on our screen and so forth, as having done computations, right? Having performed mathematical operations. That's all interpretation that I would say is not part of the fundamental fabric of the world. At any rate, we need argument. So I'm a funny kind of philosopher in that I believe in this very strong, rather strong form of emergence, right, when it comes to the mind, and yet my instincts are to be very, very suspicious about its applicability elsewhere. It's not that I'm closed to the possibility, but I have certain reductionist tendencies, and I want to say it's a high evidential bar that has to be met before we can say, no, we've got good evidence of strong emergence going on in any physical system. I think Conway's Game of Life, if you look online, it's this mathematical algorithm, and you can describe how cells interact. They just have basic properties on, off, have certain basic rules, birth, life, death rules, describe how they interact. Over time, you see complex structures appear, aggregates of things, and you can understand those structures in terms of high-level rules, but everything fundamentally really is to be explained by at the ground floor, right? What's going on, and I think that can be true of physical systems in our world, even that have remarkable macroscopic kinds of features to us. It can be true. It could be true that ultimately it's all explicable. And so I would say it's an open question whether the ability to use symbolic categories that underlie computer programs and so forth means that we've got a new form of reality, I know as you would want to say, right there in the physical world. Forget about human minds. But it is a big, big question. I didn't even address this in my talk, right? So I can see that there's a lot to be debated on that point.
I think we have time for just one more quick question. I'm going to go to Jim. Quick question, and we don't know about the answer, but maybe the question we can thank you.
Quick question. I'm a little disturbed that sometimes when you get asked hard questions, you then pitch the ball into the court of the scientist and say, well, I'm a philosopher, and a scientist deals with that. Look, you're using the word downward causality, that the mind exerts downward causality. The term causality has a long history in science, and it's changed over time, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me perfectly legitimate for me to ask you, what is your model of causality when you speak of downward causality from the mind? And you might say, well, the physicist or the scientist has to fill out the mechanics or the properties of that, but still you have a concept of causality there. And I'd like to hear a little more about what it is.
I think I can give a short answer to that. I think that the category of causality is a fundamental category for us. That is, we can't reduce the category of causality to anything else. We can use synonyms. We can use very plain language like make happen. That's what it is to cause something. Make it happen, right? Okay. So and I think we assume in our way of theorizing about the world that causality is a fundamental phenomenon. Things make other things happen, right? We try to describe that. Now, the form in which the abstract make-happen relation takes place, that would be the job for physical theory. Like it might involve transfer of mass energy. That would be a form of making happen, right? But there could be other forms as well, right? And so in downward causation, you're having some kind of make-happen relation going on between subjective mental states and physical states. And it's just going to be a distinct kind of instance of the make-happen relation.
Thank you. Yeah, to be fair, of course, we scientists, we have a difficult thing. We say, well, that's a problem for philosophers. So it's going on all the time. I'm now going to exert some top-down causation and bring this to a close. To really thank Tim for a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. And to thank you very much for a good seminar. Thank you very much.